Okay, so I'm thrilled to welcome everyone to what is definitely one of the most eagerly anticipated conversations of the day. Yeah, of course, with Chairman Behnam of the CFTC. So I'll start with a brief intro. Chairman Behnam is the 15th chairman of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, also known as the CFTC, and has really been at the forefront of addressing market-related climate risks since joining the CFTC in 2017. He's led the CFTC to prioritize, amongst many other topics, supporting the growth of high-integrity voluntary carbon markets. And since you've been chairman, the CFTC has now held 2 convenings of experts on the VCM, a number of whom spoke here today. And you've also created the Environmental Fraud Task Force to address fraud and misconduct in the VCM spot market. You issued an alert, I think about a month ago almost, 2 months ago? 2 months. Yeah, 2 months ago. Encouraging whistleblowers who know about any fraud or misconduct in the VCM to report it to the CFTC. And I think I speak for many of us in the market in saying that we view it as a sign of the market's growth and significance and maturation that you in particular and the commission are spending time in our market. And so I thank you for that very much. And I know you're doing so in a very thoughtful manner. And I'm thrilled to hear your insights today about how to create a high integrity carbon market and what the CFTC's role is. And so I want to start by zooming out and going broad for a minute. You in particular have spent many years heavily engaged in climate in general and in how to assess climate-related market risks, not specific to the carbon markets. So can you spend a few minutes talking about that?
Yeah, sure. Thanks everyone for having me here. It's great to be here. And an incredibly important week here in New York, busy week. It came up this morning on the train. I had an event earlier today, so it's great to be a part of these conversations and sort of bring the U.S. government perspective and what's going on, both individually at the CFTC and at other agencies and departments. So a little bit of context, and then I'll address the question more directly. For those of you who don't know, CFTC is a derivatives regulator. We are one of 2 market regulators within the United States government. We work closely with the Securities and Exchange Commission, which I'm sure many of you know. We regulate derivatives. Derivatives are financial products, financial contracts that their price is derived from underlying commodities. We have a long history in the US going back over 150 years to the mid-19th century. The CFTC has a history itself going back over a century within the Department of Agriculture, which is really where our history is rooted in agricultural products, futures contracts, which many of you may be familiar with, corn, soybeans, pork bellies, frozen concentrated orange juice, metals, copper, aluminum, gold, silver, energy, natural gas, oil. So we are very familiar with commodities, but we do not regulate underlying commodity transactions. We regulate only the derivatives. However, one of our very powerful tools is fraud and manipulation authority over underlying markets. So you can imagine, and I'll give you a little bit of wonky policy and why we have this authority, is if there is a manipulated transaction in what's called a cash market or an underlying physical commodity transaction, that manipulated price will be reflected in the prices of products that I regulate. So there's this correlation between the underlying market and the actual derivatives market, and Congress decided we should give the CFTC authority to police this underlying market if there's fraud or manipulation. So that's the baseline of why I'm here today, why I'm interested in VCM. Mm-hmm. To the question about my relationship with climate, and I see a friend and a former colleague, Commissioner Quintens, who I worked with for many years, and he was a part of the commission when I did some of this climate work. In 2018, 2019, I convened a group of experts, public interest, academics, market participants, to help the commission think about the relationship between climate change and financial market risk. I had certainly observed a lot of activity around this space internationally, not so much domestically. We'd seen some interest by large financial institutions, obviously the academic community and the consumer interest community, thinking about what is the relationship between climate change and financial markets. At a very basic level, you can observe, especially this past summer, heat waves, droughts, forest fires, how that affects asset prices, whether it's commercial or private residential, and what that can mean for a bank or a lending institution that has a portfolio of credit essentially out to end users, and if that value of the land depreciates because of a forest fire or flood or future degradation of that land, how that might affect that financial institution and what those ripple effects might be across the entire financial system itself. Ultimately, we came out with a report in 2020. This group was chaired by Bob Litterman, who some of you may be familiar with, 53 recommendations, very, I'll say, inclusive across financial regulators. So this was certainly not limited to the CFTC and what our authority was, but the advisory committee decided really to go big and to provide recommendations across the US government, and I think, quite frankly, across the financial system, to say these are some recommendations we think about that would help ensure the resiliency of the financial system as it relates to climate change. So disclosures, data collection, a carbon price, voluntary carbon markets, and having a well-developed, high-integrity carbon market. So this was the baseline. This was a lot of the work I had done. I was fortunate to be appointed chair of the commission in January of 2021 as acting chair, and then confirmed as permanent chair in December of 2021 by President Biden. And since then, it's really been an exercise of where do I steer the CFTC that's within the legal limits of our authority, that would have an impact on the discussions that we're all collectively having, and really as a result of what I'm seeing in our markets. So that's how I really started to focus on voluntary carbon markets. We established a climate risk unit within the CFTC back in March of 2021, really getting staff together to think about these issues and where we could focus our energy. And ultimately, as you pointed out, we had 2 convenings, one last June and then one more recently this past July, to bring folks together. And it's good to see many of you here to talk about what we could do, what we're seeing in the voluntary carbon markets, and what role the CFTC should play. So going back to what I said initially, and then we'll get to the next question, is what is my relationship legally to this market? We have 2 major exchanges that list voluntary carbon offset contracts, derivatives contracts, so futures contracts. And at least one of the contracts is essentially a weighted average of multiple registries. I think the other contract is actually a direct reference to a single registry. But this goes back to my little wonky legal analysis is you can imagine this contract that's traded on a CFTC regulated exchange has a reference point to the underlying cash market of the voluntary carbon markets. And if there is manipulation or fraud in that space, that cash market, that manipulation or fraud is going to have an impact on the markets that I regulate. And I have a vested interest in the health, the transparency, and the orderly trading of my market. So that's why we announced the Environmental Task Force within our Division of Enforcement. We're a civil enforcement agency. We bring a number of cases, enforcement cases throughout the year against registered entities, but also in this cash market, which might impact non-registered entities. And really, it's a signal that's being sent to the market that we expect this market to operate in an orderly fashion. And if we do see, or if we're told that there is fraud or manipulation, we're going to certainly use the civil enforcement authority to bring a case. And as you can imagine, I think there's a lot of very good players in this space. There's a lot of players who want to elevate the market, create transparency, create credibility, so that we can see this market scale and achieve the goals that it purports and wants to achieve. But ultimately, as with any market and as with any new market, there's going to be some perhaps players who are not meeting those standards that we would all hope. And that's where I think we can play a role, not picking winners or losers, but essentially trying to step in, use our civil enforcement authority so that if there is manipulation or if there is fraudulent activity, we can police the market and hopefully send a signal to the market that you have to comply with a set of standards that is required by law, but hopefully ultimately will have the outcome of elevating the market, scaling the market, and seeing this market develop such that we'll see this transition happen a little bit more in an orderly but also speedy way.
Excellent. First of all, very helpful to give the overview of the CFTC generally and your focus on climate, and then basically your authority and how it comes to bear on the VCM. You said something very interesting during the second convening in your remarks, where you said that you've reflected, I'm going to put your own words in your mouth, where you've reflected on the role of a modern regulator. And in part, it is to respond to facts on the ground. So I'm curious if there were any particular thoughts as you've evaluated and assessed and looked at and learned about the voluntary carbon markets, if there was anything that you observed that A, caused you to understand its role in the broader fight against climate change, like what you actually think of the VCM insofar as it's part of an overall climate mitigation effort, and then what you saw that led you to take the steps that you did in your CFTC capacity.
Yeah, so ultimately, it always goes back to what's my responsibility as the chair of a federal regulator, right? And I oversee these markets. I have a responsibility to complete the mission of the agency. And when I have listed contracts on my registered markets, as I said earlier, I have a vested interest in the health of those markets. And those markets, the health of those markets is driven by a lot of different factors, least of which, of course, is the underlying commodity market that drives that price discovery, right? And if you don't have that price discovery, our markets are for risk management, right? It's a farmer, it's a manufacturer, it's a pension fund managing interest rate risk, currency risk, credit risk, in an environment where you have geopolitical issues, interest rates going up, currency fluctuations. Our markets, you would be shocked at both how big they are, but how critical they are to the well-functioning, stable economy that we do have here in the United States. So when I have those listed contracts, just full stop, regardless of what my personal opinion is, I have to think about that oath I took and that responsibility I have to healthy markets, transparent markets, and protecting customers, right? Because as we see with any new market, there's going to be fraud, there's going to be manipulation, there are going to be opportunists out there trying to take advantage of vulnerable people, vulnerable investors, and using standard tricks of the trade, Ponzi schemes, pump and dumps, and using these tools as a flashy, oh, you want to be green? This is your best way to being green on a personal level or on a corporate level. So that was kind of, at least in part, one of my core foundational beliefs is that just responsibility I have as chair. Second, we've seen markets evolve and emerge. Markets, in many respects, there are so many different assets that trade on markets, but ultimately, regardless of whether it's a pork belly, a stock, a bond, or WTI crude, trading is trading, and you want transparent trading, you want transparent bidders, sellers, you want reporting, you want equal access, you want clearing in some respects, just to level the playing field and to make sure that you have a healthy environment. That price discovery function is critical. So these are the core components that we've learned over decades, and as we see markets like the VCM evolve and mature, we're going to naturally have an interest in its health too. Yeah. Now, the third part, and what role does the VCM play in the larger climate conversation? There are skeptics out there. I don't need to tell this audience. There's a lot of issues around integrity and credibility, and this is, again, should not be unique to this market per se. This happens often. But if I think about what role the VCM is going to play, we're obviously seeing huge amounts of commitments from corporates, from sovereigns after the Paris Agreement, hitting net zero targets. And as we've learned in the past few years, both with COVID and then the invasion of Ukraine, we are naturally going to have to rely on fossil fuels for the foreseeable future. That is, I think an inevitable reality, and that's fine. But in order to transition safely over the next few years and decades, we're going to have to find solutions, both technological through entrepreneurs, to figure out how to make that transition as orderly and smooth as possible. And that's going to come, at least in part, through the VCM. And it's not necessarily just large corporate purchasing offsets to hit those targets. It's how do we find a solution? How do we incentivize landowners, technologists, entrepreneurs, investors to allocate capital towards technology that is going to find these solutions, whether it's carbon capture, whether it's just nature-based carbon sequestration. If you have a healthy marketplace, if you have a vehicle to allow investors and risk managers to exchange both risk and capital in a transparent way and in a way that's backed by the rule of law, you will see those markets and that investment start to scale. We see it in our capital markets in the US. We obviously see it in our derivatives markets. I say this often, we have the best financial markets in the US because we have credibility, we have the rule of law, and we have accountability that's driven by both civil and criminal law enforcement. So as I see this, yeah, I get the skeptics, but my solution, my goal is not to step back and say, okay, this is just a hoax or this is not going to be a solution. It's what can I do in my capacity as chair to help support and create a credible environment so that capital allocators, investors, entrepreneurs can start to build up this space such that we'll see new technologies emerge that will help reduce carbon emissions, hit those net zero targets, and create a way for both investors and other entrepreneurs to both benefit from these markets. So a lot to do, but in the absence of legislation and congressional action on a carbon price, on a legislative framework around both voluntary carbon markets or compliance markets, I'm certainly going to do what I can with the authority I have, which is driven by both the fact that we're seeing demand, which is exemplified by the fact that I have exchanges listing offset contracts. And we're also seeing just the development of these markets organically and a need for me to step in as the chair of the agency that oversees commodity markets.
Great. Well, for one thing, I think you gave a very clear and articulate explanation of what the voluntary market is, which is it's an incentive mechanism, right? It's a way to incentivize activities that right now, the economic realities of them are such that we are cutting down trees. We are not engaging in regenerative agricultural practices. We are doing all kinds of things because of the economic incentives, and this is a way to flip them. That's exactly what the market is. It's a market-based mechanism for incentivizing the kind of climate-positive behavior that we need to see. And so thank you for just articulating what the market actually is. I want to ask about something you mentioned, which are some fun things like Ponzi schemes and pump and dump schemes. The whistleblower alert that you issued had a list of a couple of activities that you would want brought to your attention, ghost credits, wash trading, etc. It also listed one that I thought was particularly interesting. It said, and I quote, I'm going to read it, fraudulent statements relating to material terms of the carbon credits, including but not limited to quality, quantity, additionality, project type, the methodology substantiating the emissions claim, the environmental benefits, basically some of the characteristics associated with the credits themselves. And in this market, as many people know, there's sometimes complexity and nuance associated with some of these particular elements of crediting a carbon credit, especially for nature-based methodologies. These are questions we're grappling with as a market. So I'm wondering if you could share any insights on how you'd balance your approach to looking at those kinds of issues and what the emphasis of the CFTC will be with regards to elements of carbon credits.
Yeah, it's an extremely important question, and I believe at the convening that we had in July, I made this very clear. If not, then I made it clear in other public engagements. But I will be the first to say we are not an environmental regulator, right? We are a commodity market regulator, but at its core, we are a market regulator, and that's where our expertise lies. So under no circumstances am I going to task or require that my staff start to think about methodologies around carbon sequestration, additionality, and whatnot. That is not our job, that is not our responsibility, that is not our area of expertise. But you did mention that we list a number of things that we're looking for. And if you think about these two very powerful words I use, fraud and manipulation, which is what lies within the statute and gives me authority to police cash spot markets, that is where we collectively need to work together. And I can, as we develop this whistleblower program, as we start to hear from the public or others about potential fraud or manipulation, it's really going to be about, are you manipulating the price of a credit by whether any number of schemes or strategies, or are you fraudulently selling a credit to a purchaser, to an end user, saying it's one thing or purporting it to be one thing when it in fact is something else. So we will lean on the work of the private sector. We will lean on the work of other experts in the environmental space. We will lean on essentially those who come to us and share this information. And I will say, unquestionably, this is not new to us. This is in many respects how we conduct ourselves in the traditional markets we oversee right now. There is a level of expertise which is second to none globally around derivatives markets for sure. But as we bring enforcement cases against bad actors, which we do quite regularly and have very successfully over many years, we certainly rely on whistleblowers, tips, complaints, folks who are bringing information about violations of the Commodity Exchange Act. So just to really get to the heart of it is, we're not an environmental regulator, but we are a market regulator, and it's about fraud and manipulation. And I do want to, I'm going to give one quick anecdote. I don't want to take too much time, but some of you may be familiar with the Renewable Fuel Standard. This was a standard that was authorized by Congress back in 2005 or 2006. It essentially created the mechanism with which we purchase fuel right now for cars and trucks, where you blend ethanol into gas, 10%, 20%, sometimes up to 30%. And this bill was passed, and it created a policy to incentivize and require, in many respects, the blending of fuel, which would reduce our reliability of foreign nations for oil. But what I've observed, both in my former job working as a counsel in the Senate and then as a commissioner, is Congress created this program for the EPA. EPA created the rules and the regulations around this program and implemented it. But what Congress perhaps didn't think about, maybe they did, but perhaps what they didn't think about is, when you create a program like that, you're creating a marketplace. You're creating these RINs, which were essentially the credits that were bought and sold by either an energy company who either was complying with the law or not and needed to purchase them. So you had this very traditional market develop around RINs. And for many years, there was a lot of fraud and a lot of manipulation in the RINs market. But we were kind of stuck because there was no market regulator over the RINs market. And if you had a fraudulent RINs market where the price discovery wasn't occurring, it really skewed the purpose and intent of the program. So as we see many members of Congress take interest in the voluntary carbon markets, and we see different programs happening at U.S. Department of Agriculture or even the EPA, I think it's important, and I tell members of Congress this all the time, you're creating a market, and you need a transparent market in order for the program to function well and as intended. So this is where I struggle a little bit about where the limits of our authority is, because I certainly would like to see more. I want to protect investors. I want to see our markets operate well, but I also know very clearly what the limits are, and we will stay within those limits. But we will use the tools we have and limit them to the expertise we have, which is markets, but using the collective wisdom and expertise of others to make sure that we are identifying fraud, whether it's a ghost credit, or we're identifying manipulation if it's one counterparty selling a credit to another at a price that doesn't reflect supply and demand. And we will bring those cases with facts and argument, and hopefully be successful ultimately in setting a standard, but also deterring bad actors doing things in the future that would violate the law.
Yeah, which again, I think is very welcome in this market. As a company that works with institutional investors all of the time and bringing them into the market, it's obviously very helpful to have the CFTC taking that role. And so for that alone, I think it's very productive. You mentioned leaning on the work of others, which I think is great. I know that the Climate Risk Unit is working on guidance at the moment for the VCM, and I wanted to know how your efforts are progressing on that front and how it might interact with some of the other efforts that are underway in the market to create standards and guidance.
So a lot of jargon out of Washington. There are rules, there's guidance, there's advisories. They all have differing levels of power and emphasis and effect. Rules are what we do. More generally, this is directly derived from our authority under the statute. Guidance and advisory certainly is derived from authority we have within the statute. But particularly in this space, and this goes back to what I was saying earlier about there not being clear authority over the voluntary carbon markets, but us having an intersection and a legal hook into the carbon market because of the listed contracts on our registered exchanges, we would have expectations, and we do have expectations, that these exchanges that list contracts act in a certain way. That they, as I mentioned, you can think about that one contract I gave as an example. It's a listed future that is a representation of the price of a carbon offset, and it is essentially the weighted average of the price of, say, 4 registries. We would have an expectation, because of our core principles, we're a principles-based regulator, that this product that trades on a CFTC regulated exchange is not, just to give one example of a core principle, readily susceptible to fraud and manipulation. So how do you do that? You ensure that the registered exchange is not just going out and picking registries randomly and saying, okay, this is a good alphabet soup of registries, we'll do a weighted average of the 4, the 6, the 10. We would expect the registered exchange has standards which comply with our core principles to ensure the product is not readily susceptible to fraud and manipulation. And there are others around financial resources, governance, conflicts of interest, and they're all important equally, but you can imagine how some might be more important than others in an unregulated cash market. So that's the authority, which I've said now probably a few times in a different way, but ultimately it comes down to, can we put out guidance? Can we put out an advisory? And this would be with the support of the commission, so that's something that I'm working with the commissioners now. They know that this is likely coming and hopefully get their support and their input. But ultimately, it's a guidance document or an advisory that would send a signal to the registered entity that these are the expectations we have, or these are the standards that we would expect you to meet as you list contracts. The second part of the question is, what role do all of you play, or to the private sector? ICVCM, I think, is a perfect example, not picking winners or losers here, but credit to the work they've done. They've been a part of our convenings. And I know Annette Nazareth has been a leader within that group, and she's done a great job, and they've come out with core carbon principles. But this is where, going back to my earlier comment about we're not an environmental regulator, we can lean on the private sector. We can lean on market-based solutions to extract ideas and thoughts that would help us compile this advisory, this guidance. Not limited to ICVCM, not necessarily ICVCM, but just as an example, how we're going to be thinking about this, using our market-based expertise, using the work of the private sector, having a consultation, having the convenings. Ultimately, what we put out, hopefully with the commission's approval in December, by the end of the calendar year, that's my goal, is a document that will come out in the proposal phase and will seek comment from the public. So we would certainly welcome any comment from all of you to steer us in a right direction of what we're doing right, what we're doing wrong, and ultimately achieving, I think, what's a common goal of helping support the credibility and scaling of these carbon markets.
Excellent. I think the word convening is exactly right for this market. You have outstanding initiatives that are happening, whether it's the regulatory work that the CFTC is doing, the amazing work of the ICVCM, Annette was here this morning, the work of the VCMI, Mark Kenber, who spoke at your convening, was here this morning as well. And what we need is for these efforts to be convened together and to work in coordination with one another. So of course, not choosing winners or losers, but at least coordinating these efforts. And the ICVCM and the VCMI announced a very productive partnership with one another. And so their quality standards for the supply side and the demand side are now going to be end to end. And that's very badly needed in this market. So thank you for surfacing the word convening for this market. I hadn't heard it applied to the market before. It was great. I know you do other convenings, but we're going to use it for this market.
Good.
And I think we have 2 minutes. So we can either talk about IOSCO or we could take a question.
If there's a question, happy to take it.
Yeah, question? Yeah.
Should I just speak loudly?
Speak loudly.
Hi, I'm Rachel Raditzer. I'm on the JP Morgan Commodities Trading team. And so one of the biggest challenges we've been facing, which it's really great to hear from you directly, is the lack of price transparency, the concern around risk, and we're trying to serve our clients' needs while not getting them in trouble or ourselves in trouble. So we're really looking to, as you mentioned, the core carbon principles, the ICVCM, and yourselves. What do you think? I know no one can predict, but at what pace and what timeline do you think this will stabilize? I know it's a very difficult one.
Yeah, I mean, so we can only do as much as we can, and I'm hopeful that the CFTC will have an impact, knowing the history and the sort of authority the agency has with registrants like yourself. And I think the signals I've been getting from folks during the convenings, but during also bilateral meetings, is that there's a real hunger for this. There's a hunger and a desire for us to step into this space. And I'm not, I understand the importance and the weight of the responsibility I have and the CFTC does as a commission, as a group. But really, thinking about the dual purpose of both fulfilling our mission and the climate crisis, I think, with the advisory and guidance, hopefully in a proposal phase coming out later this year, and then perhaps a final coming out, say, late spring or summer, that will start to hopefully turn the wheels of where the market's at, setting a bit of a benchmark and a baseline, and elevating the market. I think statistics, we learned at the second convening that there's been a little bit of a flat line of credits in the market over the past few months. And I don't think that's a surprise per se, maybe because of the lack of movement on the regulatory side, but also that's just the natural, I think, ebb and flow of financial markets. They spike, they drop, and you know, they're figuring themselves out and who the players are going to be. So certainly it's a priority of mine to do this as quickly as possible, but there's an element of this that just has to happen organically, but hopefully with our contribution to the larger regulatory and credibility conversation, that will send a clear economic signal to the market of what our expectations are. And ultimately the most powerful impact is the deterrence impact of an enforcement agency, right? Knowing that if you don't comply, or if you're not meeting certain standards, or if you're, you know, committing fraud or manipulation, there's a phone call on the back end of that.
Yeah, and so is the next step the guidance?
Guidance, hopefully, as a proposal by the end of the calendar year. Again, fingers crossed, again, with the support of the commission. And then just thinking about the natural flow of how rules, guidance, and advisories are done, you know, 60 days comment period perhaps, and the back end of that, we have to review the comments and then finalize something, again, hopefully by next summer of 2024.
Excellent.
Setting high standards, I guess, for myself, but you know
We're
what?
all holding you to it.
It's too important not to, and I'll stick my neck out there for this one.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for...
Yeah, my pleasure.
Thank you.